Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The park bench had become his world, a weathered wooden seat beneath an old oak tree that had seen more seasons than most people could count. James sat there every afternoon, his silver hair catching the fading autumn light, his hands resting on a worn wooden cane that had belonged to his father. At 73, he had become part of the landscape, as invisible as the fallen leaves that gathered at his feet. People passed him by without a second glance. Joggers in bright athletic wear, their earbuds blocking out the world. Young mothers pushing strollers, their attention fixed on their phones. Teenagers laughing and shouting, caught up in their own universe of friendship and possibility. To all of them, James was simply another elderly man occupying space, a fixture of the park with no story, no name, no significance. But they were wrong. If they had stopped, even for a moment, they might have noticed the small pin on his jacket lapel, a purple heart, dulled by time but still present. They might have seen the way his eyes scanned the horizon with a vigilance that never quite faded, a habit born in faraway deserts and jungles where inattention could cost lives. They might have understood that the quiet man on the bench had given more to his country than most would ever know. James had served in Vietnam, then later in the First Gulf War when they called up experienced soldiers who knew what real combat meant. He had been young once, strong and certain, convinced that his service would matter, that his sacrifice would be remembered. He had watched friends fall, had carried wounded men through fire, had made decisions that still visited him in the dark hours before dawn. For 26 years, he had worn the uniform of the United States Army with pride. But that was a lifetime ago. Now his daughter lived 3 states away, her phone calls growing shorter and less frequent with each passing year. His son had his own family, his own struggles, his own life that left little room for an aging father whose stories of war made everyone uncomfortable at dinner parties. The neighbors in his small apartment building knew his face, but not his name. The world had moved on, and James had been left behind, sitting on a park bench with memories that no one wanted to hear. Except for one. Max lay at James's feet, his gray muzzle resting on his massive paws. The German Shepherd was 12 years old now, his once dark coat faded to a mixture of black and silver that mirrored his owner's hair. His hips ached on cold mornings, and his eyes had grown cloudy with the beginnings of cataracts, but his devotion had never wavered. When James shifted on the bench, Max's ears perked up immediately. When James sighed, Max lifted his head and gazed at him with eyes that held understanding beyond words. They had found each other 11 years ago at a veterans shelter event. James had gone reluctantly, dragged there by a well-meaning social worker who thought he needed community engagement. Max had been a retired military working dog, too old for service, but too loyal for abandonment. Their eyes had met across a crowded room, and something unspoken had passed between them, a recognition of shared experience, of service rendered and sacrifices made. From that day forward, they had been inseparable.
Max understood things that humans couldn't. He knew when the nightmares were coming, when James would wake at 3 in the morning drenched in sweat, his heart pounding with memories of artillery fire and screaming. On those nights, Max would be there before James even called, pressing his warm body against his owner's side, offering the kind of comfort that required no words. He knew when the sadness came, when James would sit for hours staring at photographs of men who would never grow old. Max would rest his head on James's lap, patient and steady, a living reminder that not everything had been lost. Every morning, Max waited by the door of their small apartment, refusing to let James leave without him. Every afternoon, he walked beside James to the park, his pace adjusted to match his owner's slower gait. And every evening, when they returned home to an apartment that held no voices except their own, Max stayed close, a guardian who had never learned to retire. The autumn days grew colder. James's arthritis worsened, making each step a small act of courage. Simple tasks that he had once completed without thought now required careful planning. Opening a jar, climbing the stairs to his second-floor apartment, bending down to fill Max's water bowl. His body, which had once carried a 60-pound pack through triple-digit heat, now struggled with the basic mechanics of daily life. But he never complained. Complaining was not something soldiers did. The nights were the hardest. In the darkness, the past became more real than the present. He would see their faces, Martinez, who had been 22 and engaged to a girl back in Texas, Coleman, who could fix anything mechanical and had dreamed of opening an auto shop, Davis, who carried photos of his 3 daughters and never got to see them grow up. They visited James in the quiet hours, these ghosts of men who had trusted him, who had followed him, who had died far from home. On those nights, Max would climb onto the bed, something James had never officially allowed but had long since stopped protesting. The dog's weight was a comfort, his steady breathing a rhythm that pulled James back from the edge of memory into the reality of now. Max didn't judge the tears that sometimes came. He simply stayed, warm and solid and present, proof that James wasn't entirely alone. December arrived with an early cold snap that turned the world brittle and sharp. Ice formed on sidewalks overnight, and the morning air carried the bite of true winter. James moved more carefully now, aware that a fall at his age could mean far more than bruised pride. But the park bench called to him still. It was his place, his routine, the structure that kept chaos at bay. On a Tuesday morning, when frost still clung to the grass and his breath made small clouds in the air, James slipped. It happened so quickly. One moment he was navigating the 3 steps down from his apartment building's entrance, Max at his side as always. The next, his cane hit a patch of black ice, his feet went out from under him, and the world tilted sideways. He hit the concrete hard, his hip taking the worst of it, pain exploding through his body in a wave that left him breathless and disoriented. He lay there on the cold ground, unable to rise, his cane scattered beyond reach. Above him, the winter sky was colorless and distant. He could feel the ice seeping through his coat, could feel his body's rebellion against movement. For a terrible moment, fear gripped him, the realization that he might lie here for hours, that no one would notice, that he had become so invisible that even his suffering would go unseen. But Max had not left his side. The dog stood over him, his body tense with alarm. Then, breaking the morning silence, Max began to bark. It was not the casual bark of a dog seeking attention. It was urgent, commanding, the bark of a military working dog trained to alert and protect. Again and again, Max's voice rang out, echoing off the apartment buildings, shattering the quiet indifference of the neighborhood. James tried to speak, to tell Max it would be okay, but the pain stole his words. He could only watch as his faithful companion refused to give up, refused to accept that help wouldn't come. A door opened somewhere. Max barked louder, his body turned toward the sound. Footsteps approached, running now. A young woman appeared, her face creased with concern. She knelt beside James, her phone already in her hand. "Don't move, sir. I'm calling 911. You're going to be okay." Max positioned himself between James and the woman, protective but not aggressive, his bark finally quieting, but his vigilance undiminished. As the woman spoke to the emergency dispatcher, Max returned to James's side, lowering himself carefully so that his warm body pressed against his owner's body, offering what comfort he could while they waited.
More people came. An elderly man from the building brought blankets. A teenager who had jogged past James 100 times without seeing him now stood guard at the street to direct the ambulance. The world that had forgotten James suddenly remembered, drawn by the insistent voice of a dog who had refused to let his humans suffer alone. The paramedics arrived with professional efficiency. As they carefully examined James, determining that his hip was likely fractured but that he would survive, one of them, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, noticed the Purple Heart on James's jacket. "You served," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. James managed a small nod. The paramedic's hand rested briefly on James's shoulder. "Thank you for your service, sir. We've got you now." As they loaded James onto the stretcher, his greatest concern was not for himself, but for Max. "My dog," he managed to say through the pain. "Someone needs to—" "I'll take care of him," the young woman who had found him said immediately. "I'll make sure he gets to wherever you're going. I promise." True to her word, she brought Max to the hospital later that day. The staff, moved by the story and by the obvious bond between man and dog, bent the rules and allowed Max to visit James's room. When the old German shepherd walked through that door and saw his owner safe in a hospital bed, his entire body sagged with relief. He approached slowly, carefully, and rested his gray muzzle on the edge of the bed, his eyes locked on James's face. James's hand found Max's head, fingers tangling in familiar fur. "You saved me, old friend," he whispered. "You didn't let them forget."
The recovery was slow. James's hip required surgery and weeks of physical therapy, but something had changed. The young woman who had found him, her name was Sarah, visited regularly, bringing Max for carefully scheduled visits that became the highlights of James's rehabilitation. She told her neighbors about the veteran and his loyal dog, about the man who had served his country and now lived alone, forgotten by the world he had protected. The story spread. Other neighbors began to visit. A local veterans organization reached out, connecting James with resources he hadn't known existed. A physical therapist who specialized in working with elderly veterans adjusted his schedule to help James regain his mobility. The teenager who had directed the ambulance started stopping by James's apartment to help with groceries and household tasks, curious about the quiet man's stories, eager to learn about a history that suddenly felt relevant and real. If you've been moved by James and Max's story, please take a moment to subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. These stories matter, and your support helps us share them with those who need to hear that loyalty and love never fade. When James finally returned home, his apartment felt different. Not because anything physical had changed, but because he was no longer invisible. People knew his name now. They waved when they saw him. They stopped to talk, to ask how he was feeling, to hear the stories he had carried alone for so long. But the greatest change was internal. James had spent so many years believing that his service, his sacrifice, his very existence had been forgotten, rendered meaningless by the passage of time and the indifference of a society that had moved on without him. Max's refusal to accept that narrative, his insistent barking that had shattered the silence of indifference, had proven something essential. One voice, raised in loyalty and love, could break through walls of forgetting. Spring came early that year. James returned to his park bench, moving more slowly now with his cane and his healing hip, but returning nonetheless. Max walked beside him, his gray muzzle held high, his pace matched perfectly to his owner's careful steps. When they settled on to their familiar seat beneath the oak tree, something was different. People didn't just pass by anymore. Some stopped to chat. A former soldier recognized the Purple Heart and shared his own stories of service. Children asked to pet the hero dog, and their parents listened as James quietly explained that Max had indeed been a hero, not just on one cold December morning, but every day for 11 years of unwavering companionship.
James's daughter called more often now, her conversations longer, her questions about his life more genuine. His son planned a visit with the grandchildren, wanting them to meet the grandfather they barely knew and the remarkable dog who had saved him. The social worker who had introduced James to Max years ago stopped by to see how he was doing, tears in her eyes when she saw how the bond she had witnessed being formed had ultimately saved a life. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the oak tree's new leaves and Max dozed contentedly at his feet, James reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He had served his country honorably, had given years of his life to protecting people who would never know his name. He had survived wars and losses, had carried burdens that most could never imagine, and for a long time he had believed that his service had been forgotten, that he had become just another invisible old man in a world too busy to remember.
But he had been wrong about one thing. He had never been truly forgotten. Max had remembered. Every single day, through every difficulty and every dark night, Max had remembered. And when it mattered most, when James's life had hung in the balance on a frozen morning, Max's memory, his loyalty, had been enough to bring the world running. The love of one faithful companion had reminded an entire community that heroes walk among us, often unnoticed, often alone. That the quiet man on the park bench had a story worth hearing. That service and sacrifice deserve recognition, not just in parades and ceremonies, but in the daily acknowledgement of shared humanity. As James sat on his bench that spring afternoon, Max's warmth against his leg and the sun on his face, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not because his circumstances had changed dramatically. He still lived in a small apartment, still struggled with memories and physical limitations, but because he was no longer carrying his burdens alone, because he had been seen, acknowledged, remembered. And it had all started with a dog who refused to let the world forget. Max stirred at James's feet, lifting his gray muzzle to look up at his owner. Their eyes met, and in that exchange was a conversation beyond words, a recognition of mutual devotion, of lives intertwined and made richer by their bond. James reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, his hand gentle on the old dog's head. "We're okay, aren't we, boy?" he said softly. "We're going to be okay." Max's tail thumped once against the ground, a simple affirmation. Yes. Together, they would be okay. Because loyalty doesn't forget, love doesn't abandon, and sometimes, when the world grows too busy or too distracted to see the heroes in its midst, it takes the devotion of one faithful heart to remind everyone of what truly matters. James and Max continued their daily visits to the park bench as the seasons turned. They became a fixture of the neighborhood, but no longer invisible. Now they were beloved, recognized, valued. And every time someone stopped to thank James for his service or to admire the remarkable dog who had saved him, James felt the weight of invisibility lift a little more. This is more than a story about an old veteran and his dog. It is a reminder that we are all capable of being seen, of mattering, of being remembered, if we're fortunate enough to have even one soul who refuses to let us be forgotten. It is a testament to the power of loyalty, the strength of love, and the courage required simply to keep showing up day after day, even when the world seems to have moved on without us. In the end, it wasn't grand gestures or dramatic rescues that saved James, though Max's actions that December morning had certainly saved his life. What truly saved him was the daily, ordinary, persistent presence of a companion who saw him when no one else did, who valued him when the world did not, who loved him simply for being himself. And perhaps that is the greatest gift any of us can give or receive: to be truly seen, truly known and loved anyway. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they matter, that their service and sacrifice will never be forgotten by those who truly see them. Subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts for more stories of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between heroes and their faithful companions. The park bench beneath the old oak tree still stands, and on most afternoons, if you pass by, you'll see an elderly veteran with silver hair sitting there, his hand resting on the head of a gray-muzzled German shepherd. They watch the world go by together, two old soldiers who have earned their rest, their bond a quiet testament to the enduring power of love and loyalty. They are forgotten no more.